Okay, we're going to be talking today about symptoms or root causes. Now, several years ago, a young mother phoned Angie to pray for her toddler who had just had a really bad runny nose. And they'd been to the doctor and he'd given her some medicine, but it just kept getting worse. So Angie called out to God and she was asking him, Lord, what is the hidden problem that is causing this? They're giving her the medicine, they're doing everything they know to do. Well, a couple of days later, after they had prayed, the grandmother was keeping the little girl, and she just kept pulling at her nose and crying. And finally, the grandmother started probing in the nose, up the nose, and she pulled out a wad of strapping tape that the little girl had stuffed up her nose. Isn't that just like a little one? So the mother called Angie very relieved and really rejoicing over the fact that God had shown them what the hidden problem was. Okay, now, hidden is the word I want you to hear today. That's what we're going to be looking at in this Bible study. That incident really stuck with me, and I wondered how many times we've dealt with symptoms for a while, sometimes maybe for months, and we've never even considered that wad of strapping tape that's been stuck up the nose, But there was something there no one knew about that was hidden behind the symptoms. And so many times when we live in this life, we're dealing with symptoms all the time. We're dealing with things that we don't see or know about. And God said, I want you to hear me. I don't want you to do the symptoms. I want you to go to the real problem. Now, if we want freedom, we're going to have to deal with what's hidden. We're going to have to deal with the real issues, not just the symptoms. Now, I've been noticing how many times the real problem is always a hidden issue, not always something that appears to be obvious at the time. Now, long before I even knew what deliverance was, I'd gotten into some deep depression after a satanic attack. Now, that was before I knew anything about satanic strongholds. And I was in my early 20s, and that whole testimony is on YouTube, and I think it has some things that might help a lot of people if they want to listen to it. But I didn't know about the enemy back then, didn't know anything about the enemy. So Jack ended up taking me to Dr. Ezell, and he put me through a series of electrical shock treatments. Now, I seemed to get a little bit better, but then something happened and the bottom fell out again. Well, this time, Jack took me back to Dr. Ezell, and he said, I don't care what it costs, just do whatever it takes to get her free. So let's don't drag this out. And Dr. Ezell said something very interesting that I never have forgotten. He said, I can't promise anything like that because I can only treat the symptoms. And I remember Jack just sitting there, just staring at him and saying, why can't you treat the cause? He wanted to say, you're a doctor, we're paying you a lot of money, why can't you treat the cause? But he said, because we don't know what the cause is. He said, no psychiatrist in the natural really knows the real problem behind these emotional and mental problems. So we went on treating the symptoms with medication for a good while before we did it, finally, God's way. And whoa, it opened our eyes to see how good God is and the answers that He has for us if we just go after the answers and seek God. Now, I can remember Dr. Ezell's temporary solution gave me temporary relief, but it wasn't lasting. But it taught me a very important lesson. If we want lasting results, we're going to have to do it God's way. We're going to have to in order to get to the root cause. In order to get to the problem now underneath that's not showing up in the natural. And we're going to find out that a lot of the problems we deal with, they have hidden answers. And we've got to be willing to seek God until we find out the real reason, what's going on. Now, the Lord has shown me how we tend to deal with just the symptoms on the surface. And most of the time, we fail to look deeper to find the real problem. If we think we come up with an answer, well, that's an easy way out, so we jump for it. Now, let me give you another example. As a little girl, I used to stay with my grandparents, and one night there was a dripping faucet that just kept us all awake. Well, in frustration, we had taken turns applying pressure to the valve, trying to see if we could get it to stay off. Then my grandmother came up with a seemingly wonderful temporary answer. She tied a string to the faucet and put it down into the sink, and that water ran down the string, and it didn't keep us awake, didn't make any noise. And so we thought, oh, Lord, thank you. So as a child, I was impressed with that temporary solution. As far as I was concerned, the problem had been solved. Not one thing was actually solved, though. The faucet was still leaking. The noise had been stopped, but because they didn't get to the root of the problem was still there. So I want us now to name a few things where we're failing to get to the root of the problem. We're applying maybe a quick temporary relief, but because it's not God's answer, we're not getting free. And that's why a lot of people, even Christians, are struggling because they're not getting totally free. The real problem is the root. Now, I'm just going to name some things that Satan often uses to distract us and to keep us from dealing now with the real root of the problem. In the natural, most roots are hidden and they don't show up on the surface. And the real problem is the root. So if it's not showing on the surface, many times we're not doing what we need to do to get free. What we see on the surface is the result of the root problem underneath. Now, the root of our problems are underground. They're hidden. It's kind of like the root on a plant. We don't see the root on the plant. But that root on the plant is what makes the plant grow. It does everything for the plant. But what we see and deal with on the surface is almost always just the results of the root problems underneath. Now, if we can latch hold of what I'm saying, some of those lifelong areas that we've dealt with, sometimes forever, can start getting cleared up and healed. And when they do, then the symptoms will leave. We deal with the symptoms, but the symptoms are taken care of as soon as we deal with the root problem. Now, the objective of this lesson is not to motivate us to look for roots in other people. This is not for us to use in ministry. This is for us to use for ourselves. We need to apply this lesson personally because the objective is just to get us to realize there is a root behind all of our problems. See, we'll quit spending our life just dealing with symptoms if we can get hold of this. And I'm not saying to ignore the symptoms, but instead we need to use the symptoms that we have on our body to make us dig a little deeper to find the root. Anytime that we have something going wrong, we need to say, Lord, I don't want to just deal with the symptoms. The symptoms are easy. I want to deal with the root problem, and God will show it to us if we ask Him for it. Now, the symptoms are like a fever. It's a barometer that tells us that something is back there causing the problem. Now, I read a book on inner healing, and when the author was a little boy, he had a lot of back problems. So he went to be prayed for by this lady who had been known for having a lot of prayer answers, and so the lady started praying, and in a few minutes she said, Lord, I thank you're going to help him forgive his mother. And when he did, the symptoms just completely left. The real problem had been overlooked. Now, the exact thing happened another time to a friend of mine. The girl had developed a really extreme back problem. Her sister-in-law had been unfaithful to her brother, and oh, golly, it just went all over this girl, and she just exploded on the inside when she found this out. Well, it was a number of years later when she finally forgave the sister-in-law, and she had dealt with these back problems all these years, but shockingly, as soon as she took care of that problem, as soon as she forgave the sister-in-law, then the back pain subsided and left. Who would have believed the pain in her back was coming from a root of bitterness? You know, we're not going to be able to see these deep problems that need to be taken care of, but God will reveal them to us if we're just willing to ask, seek His face. God's way is so simple. He wants us to look past the symptoms and fight the demonic assignment underneath and get to the root of the problem. And the minute we get to the root of the problem, God's answer comes in and we can get well. It's the symptoms that are anointing. It's the symptoms that are painful, and they capture our attention. So it's easy to stay preoccupied now with the symptoms that we never get around sometime to the root cause. Okay, now for example, the Lord had me begin really concentrating on developing a trust in Him. And I remember thinking, Lord, I do trust you, you know. Well, since King David now was so big on trusting God, the Lord had me start quoting the Psalms of David in first person. And He had me do that until the trust that David possessed started becoming my heart's cry. When I saw how he really trusted God, I said, God, I want that. I had thought all these years I was really trusting you, but I didn't even come close when I compared to David. And so I just started crying out, and God then started blessing me. As God opened my eyes, it became easy to see the lack of trust as hidden as it had been. And to my surprise, a number of things that I had been dealing with suddenly just kind of fell into place. I had no idea that a hidden lack of trust was behind what I'd been laboring over. Now, when we're fighting just the symptoms and we're still concentrating on the real problem, we're never going to find the full victory that way. We have to come to the place where we stop and we say, Lord, I'm not going to deal with the symptoms anymore. I want to hear your voice and I want to get to the real problem. Victor Hugo told about a ship that got caught in a terrible storm, and they didn't realize that a cannon that they were carrying broke loose down in the lower parts of the ship, and it was banging up against the sides of the ship. It was tearing gaping holes in the ship's walls with every smashing blow that came. Well, the frightened crew were so busy dealing with the obvious storm on deck, it was a horrible storm, that they were not even aware of the disaster that was going on down under the ship. But when they became aware of the real problem, they realized it wasn't the storm on deck that was their danger. The destruction that could easily have sunk the ship was going on below, hidden, and it was out of sight. And that's what happens to us so many times. The problems we have many times, they're hidden, they're out of sight until we get the answers from God. They had to look past the obvious commotion of the battle, and they had to go below and deal with the hidden problem. Now, sometimes we have to go below and we have to look deeper and we have to find the real problem in order to keep our ship from sinking. Because I'm going to tell you what, a lot of Christians are sinking. And many times I felt like the Lord showed me was because they're not dealing with the real problem. They're dealing with the surface, their reasoning. And too often we tend to deal with our mate or with our children by reacting to the symptoms rather than dealing with the real root problem. And God just kept speaking to me and saying, go to the root, go to the real root problem, and you'll get healed. Now, husbands and wives often go through unnecessary misunderstandings in their marriage because they're dealing with symptoms many times before they know to even look for the root cause. So I'm going to give you 8 things to watch for that will often cause problems in relationships, things that are hidden, things that can easily be solved when we decide that we're going to look deeper and we're going to recognize the real problem. Now, most often the real problem is something deeper than what we're seeing on the surface. Now, this list that I'm going to be giving you, this is by no means a complete list. All I'm wanting to do is to use this as examples so you'll start looking for the real problem. But this is just enough to show you what I'm talking about. Number 1 example, Jack worked long hours and he was physically tired a lot of the time. So he never wanted me to work hard. He said, I don't want you to ever get as exhausted as I feel. He thought that, but he hadn't told it to me at the time. Well, I appreciated that, but I felt guilty because I worried about how hard and how long he was working. And I knew he couldn't keep that up without doing damage to him. So I tried to do some of his jobs to save him some time. And I'd think of things that I saw that he did that I could do and help him. And I expected him to be very grateful for that, I thought that he'd be excited about my help. But when he reacted strangely, I got my feelings hurt. But when we finally decided that we were going to get to the bottom of our difference, we sat down and we communicated. And we found that the root cause of practically every misunderstanding was a lack of communication. In practically every marriage, but not just marriages, relationships, communication is a vital ingredient for every successful marriage and also for every successful relationship. Now, in this case, I had reasoned out what to do to help him because I knew he was tired. And he thought I was doing those things because I didn't like the way he did them. And so I didn't know that's what he was thinking. So there was this misunderstanding. When we got our eyes off the problem and we started to communicate, the answer came. So God taught us to set aside some time on a regular basis and just make it a priority to just communicate. And this is one of the most important things I could say to marriage couples is you're not going to get to the bottom of your problems many times if you don't have a communication going on. You need to tell the other one where you're coming from and what you're thinking. Well, he finally knew the reason behind my actions, and I found out some things that I could do for him that really would be a help, that he would like to have. And when we finally looked at the root problem, which was lack of communication, the answer was there. And it was no longer hidden. It wasn't an answer that we hadn't looked at. God had shown us to pull it to the surface and discuss it. Now, I can't think of one single problem in our marriage that has not been able to be resolved with communication. It's amazing what communication can do. Not saying that we always totally agree. Sometimes you communicate and you might not agree, but if you're communicating, then you come to an answer. You come to something that you can both deal with. Now, in that case, lack of communication was the root of the problem, but the symptoms that appeared were causing disharmony that was easily fixed when we talked it out. And I found that this can be an answer almost in every marriage or every close relationship. If they talk it out, they can both come to an answer. Communication is really the real issue. Okay, number 2, look at hopelessness and despair and depression. Those are always symptoms of another root problem. So we need to bring it out in the open and talk it out. It may not have anything to do with the mate, but sometimes we're going to find that they can have a clear answer because they're not the one under the pressure. And sometimes it just takes another set of eyes from someone who's not under the attack to be able to see the answer very clearly. And I've seen this work so many times. Okay, number 3, I knew one person who fought despair for years and years. They did all kinds of things in the natural to help make the despair better. But finally, God allowed them to see an area where they had gotten disappointed in Him years before. And the girl told me I would never have thought of that on my own. But she said when I started seeking God, He revealed that to me. It had never dawned on them, but when it was revealed, they saw it clearly. And when they repented of that problem, the disappointment in God, it completely turned their life around. And they started sharing that testimony. Number 4, self-pity is also a killer that can be easily covered over and hidden. Many times the root problem behind self-pity is spiritual laziness. When we're in self-pity, we don't want to think about that being the answer, but many times it is. It's easier to feel sorry for ourselves than it is to be honest to see where we're missing it. Now, many people don't realize that they're getting a weird pleasure from subconsciously feeling sorry for themselves. It's funny that can make a person feel good about themselves, but sometimes in a weird way it does. Self-pity feels good in a weird way, so a lot of people put up with it. It caters to the flesh, and it gives an excuse to overlook our responsibility. Now, when we fight by the arm of flesh, we see only what the other person is doing wrong. Every time. It's so easy when we're dealing with things with the arm of flesh, we're going to always see what the other one's doing wrong. And seldom will we stop and say, wait, Lord, what am I doing wrong? There's never an excuse good enough to justify self-pity, because spiritual laziness and the oh, poor me will lose the battle every single time. Now, some people forget that all the problems we deal with on the surface are coming from a deeper spiritual root that's hidden in the natural. And instead of dealing with those things God's way, many times a person invents their own way of dealing with the problem rather than determining, I'm going to find what the root is and I'm going to handle this problem God's way. It's so simple to do it God's way. It just takes a little time to stop and say, okay, Lord, I can see it. It looks like this is the problem, but Lord, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hear your voice. And it's amazing, that little short prayer, when we really mean it, can suddenly just turn our life back the right direction. Have you ever wondered why a turtle withdraws into its shell and a chameleon will change its colors to blend in? A porcupine's going to bristle? Okay, that's their way of dealing with their problems, and that's fine for the turtle, the chameleon, and the porcupine. That's God's way for them to deal with their problems. But when people deal with their problems by withdrawing, pulling up in a shell, or seeking to hide from the realities of life, or when a person acts like a chameleon and changes their behavior based on who they happen to be with, or by repressing any convictions that they might have to compromise in order not to rock the ship, or by acting like a porcupine and bristling with anger at the circumstances when people are involved, instead of dealing with the enemy. Those are not God's way, and they won't work for man. It may work for the porcupine, it may work for the chameleon, but it's never going to eliminate the problem for man. We're having to hear God and get to the bottom. And He will take us to the bottom. He'll show us the answer if we want to know badly enough. Now, when we deal with reasoning by the arm of flesh, it never works. I've never known anyone to settle a problem by reasoning it out. Remember, self-pity says, I've tried everything and nothing seems to work. Oh, poor me. And a lot of people may not be saying that, but that's what's going on the inside. So the solution just stays hidden. Sometimes we just have to be mature enough to consider spiritual laziness and be willing to do what it takes to face the hidden truth, as painful as it may be, and get set free. Because no one really wants to say, I'm spiritually lazy. Nobody wants to admit to that. But if we're honest enough with God to say, Lord, if that's there, I want it gone, God will definitely take us and set us free. Okay, number 5, rejection is another major root problem in so many people, and it hides behind a lot of different symptoms. And every symptom behind which rejection hides is a subconscious effort to protect ourselves. When someone puts up a wall, so often it's done in an attempt to protect himself from rejection. If you find yourself getting your feelings hurt time after time, look underneath for a spirit of rejection. Most times when a person is constantly getting their feelings hurt, there's a spirit of rejection involved. God's way is to simply face the hurtful situation rather than giving in to the rejection. Now, when the root is dealt with, the hurtful situation will begin to vanish. It's amazing. When we deal with the problem, God starts just taking care of it. It starts being eliminated. Okay, number 6, self-will is a biggie. I mean, there's so many. We could go into so many different areas. I'm just picking out some so that whatever you're dealing with, you'll say, okay, there is an answer. I'm going to hear your voice, and you're going to give me the answer. Now, self-will is a biggie. Sometimes the symptoms of self-will surface at a quick anger, or maybe the person appears to just come across real short or curt. Suggestions go past them, and they don't even pay any attention to them. The reason that suggestions go unnoticed is because basically a self-willed person now wants his own way. And there's a lot of people that are dealing with self-will, and they want their own way. So subconsciously, they think, why waste time listening? Now, they may not say that, but that's basically what they're thinking. Why waste time listening? I know I'm right. I want my way. So if you feel irritated when someone tries to tell you something, or if you feel disinterested, or if you find yourself being short or curt, check for self-will, because many times that's the hidden problem down underneath. Number 7, when you see one who appears to be prideful, many times that's a covering for a different problem. It's not necessarily pride. You know, everybody, when they see someone acting prideful, they think, oh, I sure don't want to be prideful like them. But a lot of times, it's not necessarily pride. When pride seems to be the obvious, many times it's just the opposite. It's often an attempt to cover up the insecurity. Insecurity jumps out in front many times, and it comes across looking like pride. Now, that's a good reason for being determined to get rid of pride, though. Now, I'm not saying that the insecurity is any more of a virtue than pride, because both are wrong. They're both self-centered. But it's important to know the root that you're dealing with to be able to deal adequately with it. Now, a person can appear haughty. They can appear arrogant, when in reality they may be feeling like they're dying on the inside from shyness and embarrassment. I've known people that, they definitely came across like they were so full of pride, and yet when you really got down and talked with them, they were so embarrassed, they were so shy, and so they put on this facade of pride to cover it up. It's a negative form of pride, becoming self-conscious instead of others conscious. But pride, in its true form, usually always hides behind something. It seldom comes out real boldly. Okay, number 8, control is another biggie. Now, control will often hide behind frustration or anger or selfishness, or sometimes it'll hide behind a judgmental attitude or fear. If you find yourself frustrated or angry when someone doesn't do what you want them to do, even if you're wanting them to do it for their own good, it's a good possibility that it's control underneath. Another symptom of manifestation of a spirit of control is the person never wanting to be controlled themselves. If a person's operating in control, they never want to be controlled. Jezebel operated in a spirit of control, and she was furious. She was in a mad rage because Elijah didn't do what she was wanting him to do. Now, she was furious and she took control to get what she wanted, and horrible things happened. Now, most people will never operate in control that's that vicious, like Jezebel. But we can look at hers, and it can allow us then to see some things to work on. But to whatever degree that control manifests, it's destructive. And most of the time, the root behind that manifestation of control is fear. Most of the time it is. And the fear is often a lack of trust in God, not trusting Him to make things work out the way we want them to work out, so that we feel that we have to control to get what we want. But just because a person is strong-willed does not necessarily mean that they have a spirit of control. There's a lot of reasons behind the control. But if we go to the root, if we ask God and go to the root, He'll show us every time what the answer is. He'll show us what it is behind that control. And then it gives us the true thing to start working on. Okay, now we haven't even scratched the surface naming roots. It wasn't my intention to explain every root or expose every root, or to learn what the root is behind every symptom. But instead, I'm just wanting us now to realize that there is a root, so that we will quit dealing with what we see in the natural. We'll quit dealing with just the symptoms. If we're just dealing with symptoms, most of the time we'll miss it, and most of the time it'll keep us living an under-poor life. Now, I'm not saying to ignore the symptoms. We just use the symptoms to make us dig a little deeper to realize what the real hidden issue is. Now, if we just continue dealing with symptoms, that's where we're going to be 20 years from now. We're going to still just be dealing with those old symptoms. It's the root of the problems that we're looking to uncover. When we get to the root, asking God and letting Him show us what the real root is, we'll be free. And when we want free more than we want anything else, and when we get really serious to be free, God's going to show us those hidden problems. He's just waiting for us to ask. Most of the time when we have a problem, we're busy covering it up rather than saying, God, show it to me. And it's a simple thing to say, okay, Lord, I'm not going to try to cover up any longer. I'm asking you to show me, reveal it. And when you reveal it, you'll give me the answer to how to come out of it. Now, when we get determined that we don't want to spend another day putting up with those demonic strongholds, when we come to that place where, Lord, I don't want to do it another day, then He will show us the way out. But I want to leave you with this reminder. God wants us to walk now in the freedom that Christ died to give us. And He'll make it possible, but we have to want it badly enough to start asking for it. Some people never ask for the answers. Therefore, He wants us to realize that most symptoms that we deal with constantly always have a hidden stronghold underneath. If we realize there's usually always a hidden stronghold, then we go to God and we say, God, I need help. It's amazing. He'll instantly, almost before the day's over, He'll start showing us what the answer is. And just like the title of this lesson, Symptoms versus Root Causes, God wants us to quit dealing with just the symptoms that are usually so obvious. And He wants us to dig deep and let God reveal the root problem in order to get completely free. And that's what God's wanting. He's wanting to get His people free. And really, the answer to getting free is just saying, God, I want to know what the problem is. I want to know what it is. And when we sincerely want it, He'll open our eyes, and we may not see what we want to see. Sometimes what God shows us is not what we want to see, but if we want to be free badly enough, God will not only show us what's there, but He'll give us the answer for coming out of it. And God is so kind and so sweet that He will make it easy for us. It's not hard when we just say, God, I want to be free. I want to please you. It's amazing what God can do. Father, I thank you that so many times when we're dealing with things and we're not finding the real cause, I thank you, Lord, that you are telling us in the Word over and over, just ask me. Just ask me, and I'll show you what the problem is, and then I'll walk you through it to get you out of it. Lord, you're so good to us. You're so good to us. You don't want to leave us in the trying to dig our way out or trying to find the answers ourselves. You're willing to just give us an answer instantly, and then not only give us the answer, but then take us by the hand and walk us out of it. Thank you, Lord, that you don't want us to keep dealing with symptoms. You want us to say, Lord, I need to know what the real cause is. And the moment we know what the real cause is, you'll give us the answer. And sometimes we can walk out on the very day. We don't even have to wait a day. Because, Lord, you're so good. Thank you for that, Lord, in Jesus' name.